All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're looking at something pretty fundamental, how to make learning and remembering easier, especially when we're dealing with, facts and ideas that might feel kind of intangible.
Yeah, that's a challenge we all face.
It really is. And luckily, you guys have sent in some really thought-provoking research. It's all about this idea of concreteness in writing and how that impacts what we actually get out of a text. So our goal really is to dig into that and pull out some concrete strategies, no pun intended, to help you all learn more effectively and really retain that knowledge.
Absolutely, because it's one thing to just read something, but it's another thing entirely to actually internalize it and be able to use it later on.
Exactly. So let's start with this concept of concreteness. When we say a text is concrete, what are we actually talking about?
Well, think about it this way. It's language that creates a picture in your mind. Words that let you see, hear, feel, maybe even smell what's being described.
Okay, so it's vivid, it's sensory.
Exactly. For example, reading about a storm surge versus just severe weather, one of those immediately conjures up a much more intense, almost visceral image.
Right, you can practically feel the wind and the waves.
That's it. So it's about using that kind of vivid language as
Hmm,
opposed to something more abstract, more conceptual.
gotcha. And as I was reading through the research, one thing that really struck me is this tension. Sometimes the information we really need to know, the crucial stuff, it's not presented in this concrete, engaging way. And conversely, sometimes the most vividly described things aren't necessarily the most important things for us to remember.
That is such a key observation, and honestly, it's at the heart of a lot of these studies. There's this constant push and pull between what grabs our interest and what's truly essential, and understanding that tension is really the first step towards figuring out how to learn more effectively.
It's like knowing which shiny objects to chase and which ones to leave behind.
That's a great analogy. And a lot of the power of concreteness, why it works so well, comes back to this theory called dual coding theory.
Dual coding theory. Okay, that sounds intriguing. Break it down for us.
So this theory suggests our brains have two kind of parallel systems for processing information. One deals with words, language, the literal meaning, and the other deals with images, sensory experiences, the kind of movie that plays in your head.
Oh, I like that. Like a book and a movie happening simultaneously.
Precisely. And concrete language, because it evokes those sensory details, it engages both of these systems. It's like you're reading the book and watching the movie at the same time. And these connections, this dual encoding, it helps us make sense of the information in a much deeper way.
It's like it's creating a richer, more multidimensional experience in our minds.
Exactly. And because it's more engaging, we're more likely to remember it later on.
So it's not just about understanding in the moment, it's about that long-term retention.
Absolutely. And the research really bears this out. Studies have shown that when people read concrete text compared to abstract text that's equally easy to read, they consistently find it easier to understand, and this is key, more interesting.
Which makes intuitive sense, right? If you can picture it, if it's vivid, you're more likely to connect with it.
Totally. And this connection, this engagement, it leads to better recall.
So it's not just about being more engaging in the moment, it's about remembering it later on.
You got it. Studies have shown a significant advantage for concrete texts when it comes to recall, and not just immediately after reading, but even later on. And here's a really neat finding. They found that when you put an abstract sentence right after a concrete one, people remember that abstract sentence better too.
Almost like the concrete sentence creates a hook for the abstract information.
Exactly. It provides a mental foothold. It's like the concrete idea is a strong branch, and the abstract idea can kind of hang on to it and come along for the ride.
I love that visual. So it's not just about making everything flashy and concrete. It's about using concreteness strategically, even to help us understand and remember those more abstract concepts.
That's a crucial point. It's about creating those connections, building bridges between the concrete and the abstract. And dual coding theory explains why this works. When we encounter that concrete language, both our verbal and nonverbal processing systems light up. Our brain starts making more connections, weaving a richer tapestry of understanding.
It's like building a mental model with multiple layers.
That's a great way to put it. And the more connections we make, the more pathways we create, the easier it is to retrieve that information later on. Plus, our nonverbal system, the one that handles those mental images, is also tied to our emotions. That helps explain why concrete text is often more engaging, even more enjoyable to read.
It's not just information, it's an experience.
You got it. Now, we all know there's this thing called real life. And in real life, not everything we need to learn is inherently fascinating.
Ugh, tell me about it.
Right. Which brings us to this idea of interest versus importance. We often assume if something's interesting, we'll remember it. And if it's important, well, it should grab our attention, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
But research suggests it's not that straightforward. How interesting we find something and how important we rate it, they're not always perfectly aligned.
So just because something's super captivating doesn't mean it's the most crucial thing to remember. And the things we really need to know, they might not always be the most exciting.
That's a great summary. There are some really compelling studies on this. For example, researchers looked at journalism articles, and they found that some paragraphs, while super vivid and emotionally engaging, weren't necessarily rated as the most important parts of the article.
So you might get swept away by a powerful anecdote, but miss the larger point.
Exactly. And in another study, participants actually remembered the details they found interesting, which, not surprisingly, were often the more concrete, image-rich parts, regardless of whether they considered those details actually important.
Oh, I totally relate to that. Like remembering a funny story from a lecture, but blanking on the core concept.
It happens to all of us. And another study found that while you can make important main idea sentences more interesting by using more concrete language, making them more personal, that kind of thing, if the underlying idea is still very abstract, it can still be tough to remember.
So even if you dress it up a bit, that core abstract idea might still slip through the cracks.
It might, which means we need to be even more strategic about how we approach those kinds of concepts.
So it's not about making everything exciting and concrete, but really focusing on the important stuff and using concreteness as a tool to make those ideas both interesting and memorable.
You nailed it. Now, this leads us to a really fascinating debate in the research world, the ideas of seductive details and seductive abstractions.
Ooh, those sound a bit dangerous. What are we talking about here?
So, seductive details, the term was coined by researchers who were concerned that adding really interesting, often very concrete information that wasn't strictly essential to understanding the main point could actually backfire.
Like a shiny object that distracts you from the real treasure.
Exactly. The worry was these interesting but ultimately irrelevant details might pull our attention away from and even hinder our memory of the more important, often more abstract information.
So the fear was that we'd get so caught up in the fun stuff that we'd miss the core concepts.
That was the idea. But then other researchers came along and said, wait a minute, what about seductive abstractions?
The seductive abstractions, those sound even more insidious.
Right. These are abstract statements that sound really important, but they're often poorly understood and therefore not well remembered.
Oh, so it's not the interesting details that are the problem, it's the abstract stuff that just goes right over our heads.
In a lot of cases, that might be the bigger hurdle. And what's really interesting is that several studies actually found that those seductive details, they didn't necessarily hurt people's recall of the important abstract information.
Huh. That's kind of counterintuitive.
It is. The thinking is that the abstract material is often difficult to remember anyway, so those interesting but irrelevant details aren't really making things worse. It's like the abstract stuff is already so hard to grasp, a few extra details aren't going to tip the scales.
So it's not the details that are the enemy, it's the inherent difficulty of the abstract concepts themselves.
Exactly. Now, there were some studies that did suggest a negative impact from those seductive details, but the way those details were added, it might have actually disrupted the coherence of the text, or even shifted what people perceived as the main point.
So it wasn't the interestingness itself, but how it was integrated that caused the problem.
Exactly. And another study even found that a clear, well-organized text structure like presenting information in a problem-solution format could be more beneficial than just trying to make the content more interesting by adding vivid elements to text that was already fairly concrete.
So sometimes it's not about being flashy, it's about being clear and organized.
That's a really important takeaway. Structure matters.
No,
Now, all of this research, it gives us some really practical advice.
let's get to it. What are the takeaways here? How can we use these insights to become better learners and also to create better learning materials for others?
Well, a great place to start is with a classic piece of advice from Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. They advocate for using definite, specific, concrete language.
Show, don't tell, right?
Exactly. They argue that being specific and concrete is the most effective way to grab and hold a reader's attention. And even when you're dealing with abstract ideas, you need to bring them down to earth with clear, concrete examples.
Show how they work in the real world.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
This connects back to a study where researchers looked at science textbooks. They found that important concepts that were poorly remembered were often super dense and abstract, whereas less important but easily recalled ideas, they were often paired with vivid, sometimes even silly, examples.
Ah, so those quirky examples actually helped make the concepts stick.
They did. And there's a great example with the definition of species. The textbook definition of a group of individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring is pretty abstract, right?
Yeah, it's not exactly grabbing you by the collar.
But then they added these concrete examples like horses and donkeys producing mules, which are sterile, so they're not a separate species. Or polar bears and brown bears, they rarely interbreed because they live in different places. Suddenly the concept becomes crystal clear.
Oh, those examples are so much easier to grasp. And they're more memorable, too.
Precisely. So the takeaway isn't to avoid abstract ideas altogether. They're essential for understanding complex topics. But we need to anchor those abstractions in concrete reality.
Ground them in something we can relate to.
Exactly. And there's some great examples of this in practice. One researcher revised history textbooks, making the language more vivid, more image-evoking. For instance, instead of saying England's trade was the source of her economic strength, he changed it to England's trade was the sinew of her economic strength.
Oh, wow. That one word change makes a huge difference. Suddenly, you can picture those trade routes as the muscles and tendons holding the whole country together.
It creates such a powerful image. And another group of researchers worked on making history textbooks more engaging for fourth graders. They used more conversational language, more human stories. So a line like, their motto became, no taxation without representation. They changed it to something like, as the colonists' anger swept across the land, you could hear the cry, no taxation without representation.
Wow, it's like you're right there in the middle of the action.
That's the idea. And even in something like math, just using the word you in problems instead of some abstract third person can make a huge difference, especially for younger learners.
Oh, that's fascinating. So instead of Pat has 3 marbles, it's you have 3 marbles.
Exactly. It makes it so much more personal and engaging. And it shows how even small changes in language can have a big impact on understanding and remembering.
And it all comes back to dual coding theory, right?
It does. It provides the framework for understanding why concreteness is so effective. When we use concrete language, we're activating both those processing systems in the brain. And those multiple representations, they make the information much more sticky. And this applies whether or not we think the information is particularly important or if it's something we're already familiar with.
It's like adding extra layers of meaning, multiple hooks for the information to catch on to.
That's a great way to think about it. And the connection between concreteness and interest, that also fits right into dual coding theory. Our emotions, our feelings, what researchers call affect, are associated with that nonverbal system. So when we create those vivid mental images, we're also triggering a stronger emotional response.
Which makes it more engaging, more interesting, more likely to stick with us.
Exactly. And that brings us to another interesting question. How do researchers actually measure concreteness? How image-provoking a piece of language is?
That's a great question. How do you quantify something like that?
Well, early on, they often relied on subjective ratings, asking people how vivid the mental images were that they created. But more recent research suggests that the ease with which someone can generate an image, regardless of how clear or vivid it is, might be a better predictor of how well they'll remember and understand the information.
So it's not about the quality of the mental picture, it's about the act of creating it, of engaging that nonverbal processing system.
That's the key. It's about getting both sides of the brain involved, both the book and the movie working together.
That's such a powerful takeaway. Concreteness acts like a bridge, connecting our verbal understanding with our ability to create mental images. And this makes information more interesting, easier to understand, and much more likely to stick with us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And while what we find interesting and what's truly important aren't always the same thing, we can use concreteness strategically, especially when it comes to those crucial but potentially abstract concepts.
That's where it really shines. And it's something we can all do, both as learners and as communicators.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you all with a thought. Consider all the different kinds of information you encounter every day. News articles, work documents, learning materials. How could you apply these principles of concreteness to make them more impactful, more memorable? What could you tweak? What could you add to really enhance your own understanding or to make it easier for others to grasp those complex ideas? And on the flip side, what might happen if we tried to make absolutely everything concrete? Could we lose some of the nuance, the ability to think in abstract terms? It's a fascinating question and one that I encourage you all to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.